My unfaithful wife agreed to dinner with another man and told me to turn a blind eye because it's nothing serious, so I turned a blind eye to our marriage. Hey everyone, my name is Nathan, and I'm 29 years old. I've been married to Victoria for 9 years now, and we live in Tampa, Florida. For the longest time, I thought life was good, really good. We had built something together that felt solid, meaningful, and worth protecting. But looking back now, I realized that somewhere along the way, the foundation we built started cracking, and I was too busy trying to keep everything together to notice how deep those cracks had become. Tonight changed everything. I heard the sharp click of the front door lock echoing through our house, followed by the distinctive sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor in our entryway. The rhythm wasn't hurried or slow. It was deliberate, measured, purposeful. Victoria has always walked like she expects people to look up when she enters a room, like every hallway is her personal runway and the world should take notice. Even after all these years, she carries herself with that same confident stride that first caught my attention all those years ago. But tonight felt different. The silence between us had grown thicker than concrete over the past few months, suffocating and heavy. Despite everything that had been building between us, she still strutted past me with her chin held high, her fingers absently twisting the little silver bracelet around her wrist. I recognized that gesture. It was something she did when she was thinking, processing, calculating her next move. Only tonight, she didn't seem nervous about whatever was coming. She wasn't anxious or uncertain. If anything, she seemed completely in control. She stopped near the hallway mirror, the one we'd hung together during our second year of marriage when we were still excited about making this house feel like home. I watched her touch up her lipstick with practiced precision. Crimson red, bold and striking. The color hit me like a punch to the gut because she hadn't worn red lipstick in years. Not since our 3rd anniversary when we took that romantic trip to Miami. Back then, she wore it for me because she knew how much I loved the way it looked against her skin. Tonight, that same red lipstick wasn't for me, and we both knew it. "You're going out?" I asked from the living room, my voice carrying across the space between us. I wasn't even pretending to read anymore. The book had been open in my lap for the past 25 minutes, but I hadn't turned a single page. My attention had been completely focused on her movements, her energy, the way she was preparing herself for something that clearly didn't involve me. She didn't bother looking in my direction. Instead, she just smirked at her reflection in the mirror, that same self-satisfied expression I'd seen more and more often lately. "Relax," she said casually, grabbing her purse from the side table where she always left it. Her tone was dismissive, almost mocking. "It's only a date." I didn't respond immediately. I couldn't. I just sat there and watched her, studying every detail of this moment that I somehow knew would change everything between us. The hallway light cast long shadows across her shoulders, and everything about her posture, her words, her entire demeanor felt calculated and intentional. It was like she wanted to be caught, but not in the way someone seeks forgiveness or understanding. She wanted to be seen, wanted me to witness this moment of defiance, this declaration of independence from our marriage. No, not caught. She wanted to be seen making this choice, wanted me to understand that she was claiming her freedom whether I approved or not. She turned around like she expected me to yell, to fight back, to slam something against the wall in a burst of rage and desperation. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I got up slowly from the couch, my movements deliberate and calm. I walked into the kitchen without saying a word, my mind strangely clear despite the earthquake that had just shattered my world. I removed my wedding ring. I didn't throw it across the room in anger. I didn't curse or shout or demand explanations. I simply took it off my finger and laid it down on the counter next to the dish rack, pressing it there with my thumb until it stopped spinning. The simple gold band that had meant everything to me for 9 years suddenly felt like nothing more than a piece of metal, and I watched it settle into stillness with a strange sense of finality. She didn't ask what I was doing. She didn't even blink or acknowledge what had just happened. The front door closed behind her with a soft click, and just like that, she was gone. The house fell into a silence that felt different from any quiet we'd shared before. Not peaceful, not tense, just empty. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the ring on the counter, trying to process how 9 years of marriage could end with such casual cruelty. Victoria and I first met 11 years ago at a friend's wedding. She was an absolute firecracker back then, bold, sharp-witted, and magnetic in a way that drew every eye in the room. She had this laugh that could silence an entire room, making everyone turn to see what could possibly be that funny. I was immediately attracted to that wild energy of hers, the way she seemed to live life at full volume without apology. I liked that she was unpredictable, that she kept me on my toes, that being with her felt like an adventure I never wanted to end. What I didn't realize at the time was that wild doesn't always mean loyal. I learned too late that unpredictable doesn't stop being unpredictable just because there's a wedding ring involved. The very qualities that made me fall in love with her, her independence, her refusal to be contained, her need for constant stimulation, would eventually become the things that drove her away from me and into someone else's arms. The first few years of our marriage were honestly good. Not perfect, because no marriage ever is, but genuinely good. We took spontaneous road trips to places we'd never been, staying in cheap motels and eating at diners that served breakfast all day. We had long, messy, passionate fights about everything and nothing, followed by even longer reconciliations that reminded us why we chose each other in the first place. Those arguments never felt destructive back then. They felt like two people who cared enough to fight for what they wanted. She used to surprise me at work with lunch, showing up unannounced with takeout from my favorite restaurant and that mischievous smile that meant she had something planned for later. She'd leave little notes in my bag when I had to travel for business, silly messages that would make me smile when I found them in hotel rooms hundreds of miles away. Victoria had this incredible ability to make everything feel electric, charged with possibility and excitement. She made ordinary moments feel special just by being present in them, until she didn't. The change wasn't one big catastrophic event at first. It was slow and insidious, like a leak hidden somewhere in the walls that you don't notice until the whole room starts to smell like mildew and decay. By the time you realize what's happening, the damage has already spread too far to fix with simple repairs. That's exactly how our marriage started to rot, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day I woke up and realized I was living with a stranger. She stopped laughing at my jokes, even the ones that used to make her double over with laughter. Her text messages became shorter and more functional, stripped of the playful banter and inside jokes that used to pepper our daily conversations. She started staying out late more frequently, always with vague explanations about losing track of time or getting caught up with friends I'd never heard her mention before. When I'd ask for details, she'd give me that look, the one that made me feel like I was being unreasonably suspicious for wanting to know where my wife had been until midnight. The physical changes were subtle but unmistakable. She began locking her phone religiously, something she'd never done in all our years together. She'd turn it face down during dinner, during movies, during any moment when we might have actually connected. She stopped reaching for my hand when we sat together in the car, stopped curling up against me on the couch during our evening routine. All these little intimacies that had once been as natural as breathing just disappeared, leaving behind an invisible wall that grew higher with each passing day. One night, about 4 months ago, I finally worked up the courage to ask her directly if she still loved me. It was a question that had been burning in my chest for weeks, keeping me awake at night as I lay there wondering what had happened to the woman who used to trace patterns on my chest while we talked about our future. She didn't even answer with words. She just sighed, this heavy, exhausted sound that made me feel like I was being dramatically needy for asking such a basic question. Then she went back to scrolling through her phone like I hadn't just asked her about the foundation of our entire relationship. I remember that night specifically because that was when I started sleeping with my back to her. It was a small act of self-preservation, but it felt monumental at the time. For years, we'd been the kind of couple that naturally gravitated toward each other in sleep. She used to be so warm at night, always reaching out unconsciously to touch me, tucking her legs between mine like we were puzzle pieces designed to fit together perfectly. Now the bed felt like a cold expanse of territory divided by invisible borders, with both of us facing away from each other, separated by sheets and silence, and all the things we were no longer saying. I should have recognized the signs much sooner, but I kept making excuses for her behavior. Victoria has never been someone who does neutral. She's always been either hot or cold, passionate or distant, with very little middle ground. But lately, every time she looked at me, her eyes held this tired, practiced patience, like I was a coworker she barely tolerated rather than the man she'd promised to love for the rest of her life. It was the look you give someone when you're counting down the minutes until you can politely escape their presence. And then tonight happened. Tonight, she looked absolutely beautiful, and that's somehow the worst part of this entire nightmare. She was wearing a midnight blue dress that hugged her figure in all the right places, The kind of dress that would make any man stop and stare. But she didn't ask me how it looked. She didn't seek my approval or opinion because she simply didn't care what I thought anymore. That realization hit me harder than any argument we'd ever had. The perfume she wore was heavier than usual, richer and more intoxicating than anything I'd smelled on her before. It wasn't the light, floral scent she typically chose for date nights with me. This was something new, something deliberate, something chosen specifically for someone else's preferences. I didn't recognize the fragrance, but I recognized the intention behind it immediately. She was dressing for someone, putting effort into her appearance, making herself beautiful and desirable. Just not for me. I didn't ask where she was going because part of me already knew the answer would destroy me. I didn't ask who she was meeting because I wasn't sure I was ready to hear a name attached to my wife's betrayal. But I could read everything I needed to know in her posture, in that defiant way she carried herself, in the way she left our house like she wanted the door to slam just loud enough for me to feel the finality of it echoing through our home. After she left, I sat down at the kitchen table and really looked at my wedding ring for the first time in months. It caught the overhead light, still warm from my hand, and I found myself thinking about the weight of it. Not the physical weight, but everything it was supposed to represent. 9 years of trying, of forgiving, of telling myself that she was just stressed or tired or wired differently than me. 9 years of brushing off the gut punches as misunderstandings, of giving her the benefit of the doubt when my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She had said it's only a date with such casual cruelty, like our entire marriage was just an old sweater she could toss in the back of the closet when it was no longer convenient. For the first time, I realized something that shattered my understanding of our relationship. I wasn't married to a woman I didn't know anymore. I was married to a woman who didn't care if I knew who she really was. She had stopped pretending to be the person I fell in love with because my opinion of her no longer mattered. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling, one arm folded behind my head, the other resting in the space where her body used to curve against mine. Her side of the mattress remained untouched, the sheets smoothed perfectly, like they'd been made in a hotel room that was never meant to feel like home. I kept glancing over at her empty space, some foolish part of me hoping she might walk through the door and tell me it was all some cruel joke, some dramatic scene from a podcast she'd been obsessing over. But the silence held its ground, thick and unforgiving. The clock ticked past midnight, then 1 in the morning, then 2. I watched those glowing numbers change like I was waiting for something meaningful to happen, some revelation or resolution that would never arrive. The house felt different without her in it, not peaceful but hollow, like the last bit of life had been drained from rooms that used to feel warm and welcoming. Around 2:47 in the morning, I saw headlights sweep across our bedroom wall, cutting through the darkness like a spotlight announcing her return. I didn't move from my position on the bed, just listened to the familiar sounds of her coming home. Her key sliding into the front door lock, her heels clicking against the marble entryway, the soft whisper of fabric as she slipped off her shoes. But there was something different about the way she moved through our house that night. There was no guilt in her movements, no hesitation or attempt to be quiet out of consideration for the fact that I might be sleeping. She wasn't creeping around like someone who had just betrayed their spouse. Instead, she came into the bedroom humming softly under her breath, humming like a woman who had just returned from an evening of dancing, not someone who had just stepped completely outside the boundaries of her marriage. The casual nature of her return was almost more devastating than her initial departure. She noticed I was awake and blinked in surprise, like I was the one intruding on something private. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone carrying a hint of annoyance rather than concern or guilt. Without waiting for an answer, she began slipping out of that midnight blue dress with zero effort to hide herself from me, tossing it carelessly over the chair where my work jacket had been hanging for 3 days too long. The way she undressed was completely matter-of-fact, like this was just another ordinary night in our marriage. She moved to the bathroom and began wiping off her makeup with the same mechanical precision she'd used to apply it hours earlier. She was still talking like this whole situation was perfectly normal, making casual comments about traffic and the weather like we were roommates discussing our separate evenings. I said nothing in response, which seemed to catch her attention. When she noticed my silence, her tone shifted slightly, a little edge sliding under the surface of her voice. "Oh, come on, don't do this," she said, walking back into the bedroom with her robe hanging open like modesty was a concept that no longer applied to our relationship. "I told you it was just a date. You're seriously going to be mad about this?" Her voice was rising now, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me like I was being unreasonably dramatic about the whole situation. "I told you I needed to feel alive again," she continued, her voice taking on that defensive tone I'd heard so many times before. "You said you wanted me to be happy. Or did you only mean that when I was miserable with you?" The accusation hung in the air between us, as if my desire for her happiness somehow justified her decision to seek it in another man's arms. I still didn't say a word. I couldn't trust myself to speak without saying something I might regret, and part of me was fascinated by this performance she was putting on. She scoffed at my continued silence, shaking her head like I was being childish and petty. "God, you're so dramatic, Nathan," she said, climbing into bed with an exaggerated sigh. But she didn't go to her usual side of the mattress. Instead, she sprawled across the middle like she owned not just her space but mine as well, like she had claimed the entire territory of our marriage for herself. That was the moment when something fundamental shifted inside me, not with rage or even sadness, but with something else entirely, something hollow and final. I didn't recognize this woman lying in my bed. She used to ask about my day with genuine interest and care. Now she was asking me to excuse and accept her betrayal like it was a minor inconvenience I needed to get over. I turned away from her, not wanting to see her face anymore, not wanting to smell the unfamiliar cologne that clung to her hair and skin. Cologne that definitely wasn't mine. She muttered something under her breath, maybe my name, maybe just some dismissive comment about my reaction. I couldn't tell and didn't care anymore. Within 5 minutes, she was fast asleep, breathing deeply and peacefully like absolutely nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just detonated our entire marriage and walked away from the rubble in designer heels. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the wall, trying to remember the last time she had kissed me with genuine affection. Not the obligatory peck on the cheek before leaving for work. Not the perfunctory goodnight kiss that had become as mechanical as brushing our teeth. I was searching my memory for the last time she had kissed me like she meant it. Like she actually wanted to be close to me. Like I was someone she desired rather than someone she tolerated. I couldn't remember when that had been, and that realization was almost as devastating as everything else. In the darkness, I knew that my wedding ring was still sitting on the kitchen counter downstairs, catching whatever moonlight filtered through the windows. Without even needing to touch it again, I understood with absolute certainty that I would never be putting it back on my finger. That simple gold band had become a symbol of promises that only one of us had kept, vows that only one of us still honored. The morning came with a pale, lifeless quality that seemed to match my emotional state perfectly. Victoria was already gone when I finally opened my eyes, vanished from our home without leaving so much as a note or a text message explaining where she was going or when she might return. There was no sound of a car engine starting, no familiar routine of her getting ready for work. She had simply disappeared, leaving behind only the lingering smell of her perfume, faintly clinging to the sheets like evidence of a crime. On the kitchen counter, I found a half-empty bottle of apple juice that she'd left out overnight, now sweating condensation into a perfect ring on the wood surface. It was such a small thing, but it felt symbolic somehow. Another mark left behind by someone who no longer cared enough to clean up after herself. Another sign of disrespect in a house that used to feel like a home we both maintained together. I called in sick to work that day. I couldn't face the idea of sitting through meetings and pretending everything was normal when my entire world had shifted on its axis overnight. My body went through the familiar motions, shower, coffee, toast, but my mind was completely somewhere else, stuck in an endless loop replaying every moment from the night before. Every word she'd said, every gesture, every casual cruelty was burned into my memory with perfect clarity. The way she had said just a date kept echoing in my head like a broken record. She had delivered those words like our entire life together was nothing more than an old sweater she could toss in the back of her closet when it was no longer fashionable or convenient. The casual dismissal of 9 years of marriage, 9 years of building a life together, 9 years of shared dreams and compromises, and small daily acts of love. All of it reduced to an inconvenience she needed to work around. My phone buzzed twice around 10 in the morning with work emails, but I ignored them completely. I couldn't focus on spreadsheets and conference calls when my mind was consumed with trying to make sense of how we had gotten to this point. I spent the morning pacing through our house like a caged animal, seeing familiar spaces with new eyes, wondering how many lies had been told in each room. I tried to rationalize what had happened, searching for explanations that might make sense of Victoria's behavior. Maybe she was having some kind of midlife crisis, I told myself. Maybe this was her version of rebellion against the routine and predictability of married life. Perhaps she was testing our relationship in some twisted way, pushing boundaries to see how much I would tolerate before finally standing up for myself. But even as I attempted these mental gymnastics, I knew the truth was much uglier and more straightforward than any of those comforting theories. At 11:18 in the morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened her laptop, the one she rarely used anymore because she claimed her phone was easier and more convenient. The device still auto-connected to our home Wi-Fi, and I found myself staring at the screen with my heart pounding like I was about to commit some terrible crime. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe nothing, maybe everything, maybe just some evidence that would either confirm my worst fears or prove that I was being paranoid and unreasonable. I didn't have to dig very deep. The evidence was right there, waiting for me like a slap in the face. There were messages, dozens of them, scattered across various apps and platforms. But what really made my blood run cold was a browser tab that had been left open, displaying a sleek booking confirmation for a cabin rental about 2 hours away from Tampa. The reservation was for this upcoming weekend, and there were 2 names listed on the receipt: Victoria and someone named Blake. Not Victoria and Nathan. Not a couple's romantic getaway for a husband and wife trying to reconnect. Just her and Blake. This man she had never once mentioned in any conversation. This person who had apparently become significant enough in her life to warrant a weekend retreat together. There was no explanation, no context that could make this innocent. It was just the glaring, undeniable truth that my wife was planning a romantic escape with another man. The messages between them were even worse than the cabin reservation. I managed to read 3 of them before my stomach turned, and I couldn't continue. She called him B in her texts, this intimate nickname that spoke of familiarity and affection. She told him that he made her feel like herself again, like she had rediscovered some essential part of her identity that had been lost. But the line that hit me harder than any physical blow was when she wrote that she wished she had met him before. All the mess. All the mess. That's what I was to her. That's what our house, our memories, our shared history, our promises to each other had become in her mind. All the mess. 9 years of marriage, of building a life together, of supporting each other through good times and bad, of creating something meaningful and lasting. All of it reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience, a complication that was preventing her from being truly happy. I closed the laptop and sat in our kitchen for 35 straight minutes, staring at the floor with my hands balled into fists so tight my knuckles had turned white. I wanted to throw something, to scream, to release this building pressure in my chest that felt like it might explode if I didn't find some outlet for it. But I didn't do any of those things. I just sat there, heart hammering like a war drum, breathing like I had just run 5 miles at full sprint. The rational part of my mind kept trying to process what I had discovered, but my emotions were overwhelming any attempt at logical thinking. This wasn't just about her going on a date. This was about planning, deception, emotional investment in someone else. This was about her building a relationship with another man while living in our house, sleeping in our bed, pretending to be my wife. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. Just one line, cold and matter-of-fact, "Don't wait up tonight." No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened between us the night before. Just that simple directive, delivered like I was some kind of roommate she needed to inform about her schedule rather than her husband of 9 years who deserved honesty and respect. I stared at that message for a long time before finally typing back a response that surprised even me with its simplicity. I won't. But as I sent those 2 words, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. The man who had been patient and forgiving for so long. The husband who had been endlessly hopeful that things would get better. Who had made excuse after excuse for her behavior. That version of myself had just walked out the door. What remained was someone colder, clearer, and completely tired of pretending that any of this was acceptable. I started gathering my things, not in a frantic or emotional way, but with the methodical precision of someone who had finally made a decision they should have made months ago. I wasn't packing her belongings. Those could stay exactly where they were. I was collecting what belonged to me, the pieces of my identity that had somehow gotten lost in the chaos of trying to save a marriage that was already dead. I pulled out a duffel bag from our bedroom closet and began folding clothes like I was packing for a long trip. But I wasn't planning to go anywhere, not yet anyway. I just needed to do something, anything that would give me a sense of control in a situation where I had felt powerless for far too long. The simple act of taking ownership of my possessions felt like the first step toward taking ownership of my life again. While I was organizing my things, I came across Victoria's wedding dress hanging in the guest room closet. She had insisted on keeping it there for memory's sake, claiming it was too meaningful to get rid of even though she would never wear it again. Looking at it now, that pristine white fabric seemed to mock everything we had promised each other on our wedding day. I carefully placed it in a vacuum-sealed bag and carried it out to the garage, thinking bitterly about memories and what they're actually worth when the person who made them with you no longer values what you built together. Then I sat down at our kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not a goodbye letter or some dramatic manifesto, but simply a record of who Victoria had become and what I had allowed myself to tolerate in the name of keeping the peace. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel confused or uncertain about what was happening to us. I felt ready to stop playing games, ready to stop accepting crumbs when I deserved a full meal, ready to stop pretending that love was supposed to hurt this much. By the time Victoria came home that night, well past midnight once again, I had already decided that I wasn't going to participate in her version of our marriage anymore. No more pretending that her behavior was acceptable, no more silence when she expected me to just absorb her casual cruelty. No more letting her speak in riddles and half-truths while I exhausted myself, trying to decode the pain like it was some kind of puzzle I was supposed to solve for her entertainment. This time, I didn't wait in the bedroom like some pathetic husband, hoping for scraps of attention from his unfaithful wife. Instead, I was sitting in the kitchen at our table under that dim overhead light that always buzzed faintly when it got too hot. I had my laptop open in front of me, not for show or drama, but because I was logged into our shared bank account, studying the transaction history with the kind of attention I should have been paying months ago. Victoria didn't see me at first when she came through the front door. I heard the familiar sound of the lock disengaging, followed by something I hadn't heard in years, her laugh. Not the forced or fake version she'd been giving me lately, but a genuine, light, carefree sound that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with over a decade ago. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me that I was hearing her real happiness for the first time in months, and it was because of another man. The laughter filtered in from the entryway, followed by a pause where I expected to hear a second voice. Maybe Blake saying goodbye or making plans for their next encounter. But there was just silence. Then the familiar clink of her keys landing in the ceramic bowl we kept by the front door. I listened to her routine, the sound of her heels coming off, the shuffle of stocking feet against our hardwood floors. She wasn't even bothering to hide anymore, wasn't making any effort to be quiet or considerate. When she finally turned the corner into the kitchen and saw me sitting there, she stopped short and blinked in surprise. "Oh," she said flatly, like I was an unwelcome interruption to her evening. "You're up." There was no guilt in her voice, no embarrassment about coming home after midnight again. If anything, she seemed annoyed that I was awake and present, like my consciousness was somehow an inconvenience to her. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice steady and calm. It wasn't really a question. We both knew I already understood what was happening, but I wanted to hear what story she would tell, what version of the truth she thought I deserved. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically and leaned against the wall like she was the one being wronged in this situation. "You really want to do this again?" she asked, her tone dripping with exasperation. It was the same dismissive attitude she'd been using for months whenever I tried to address the growing distance between us. "No," I said calmly, surprising myself with how controlled I sounded. "I want the truth." For years, she had used that scoffing, eye-rolling routine to minimize my concerns and escape accountability. But tonight, I wasn't going to let her deflect or change the subject. She scoffed again, but I didn't flinch or back down. "Dinner, drinks," she said with a casual shrug, like she was describing a business meeting. Blake had a rough week. She delivered this information as if I should somehow care about Blake's professional problems, as if his emotional needs were now a legitimate concern in our marriage. I nodded slowly, processing her words. "So you're calling it what it is now," I said. "You're just saying it openly." "What?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. "Now it's a date." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something crack slightly in her carefully constructed facade. "What difference does it make?" she finally asked, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You've known what's been happening. You're just looking for a reason to be dramatic about it." I set my phone down on the table deliberately, maintaining eye contact. "Victoria, you're cheating on me." The words hung in the air between us, simple and undeniable. I had finally said what we both knew was true. stripped away all the euphemisms and justifications and called it exactly what it was. She flinched when I said the word cheating, just a tiny twitch in her jaw that betrayed the fact that hearing it spoken aloud had an impact. But then, to my complete amazement, she laughed. She actually laughed, a sound that was both bitter and dismissive, like I had just said something absurdly naive. "You call it cheating?" she said, walking toward our refrigerator and pulling out a bottle of wine like we were having some casual dinner party conversation. "You checked out years ago, Nathan. Don't pretend like you're some wounded saint now." She moved through our kitchen with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she felt completely justified in her actions, like she was the victim in this situation, rather than the perpetrator. She poured herself a glass of wine without bothering to ask if I wanted one, a small gesture that somehow encapsulated everything wrong with our relationship. She hadn't asked me what I wanted or needed in months, hadn't considered my feelings or perspective in any decision she made. After taking a long, deliberate sip, she continued her attack. "Yeah, you work, you sleep, you don't do anything anymore," she said, her voice rising with each accusation. "You don't make me feel anything. You don't make me feel alive or excited or desired. At least Blake listens to me when I talk. At least he pays attention to what I'm saying." It was the first time she had said his name out loud in front of me, and she spoke it like he was an old friend rather than the man who was helping her destroy our marriage. The way she said Blake, with familiarity and warmth, hit me like a physical blow. She spoke his name like it belonged in our kitchen, like he was already part of our lives in some legitimate way. She hadn't just stepped outside our marriage physically. She had emotionally invested in someone else to the point where his name rolled off her tongue naturally while she stood in our home, wearing our shared wedding ring, defending her betrayal. "And that justifies this?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. "Lying to me? Sneaking around behind my back? Planning romantic getaways with another man?" She rolled her eyes again, that same dismissive gesture that had become her default response to any criticism or confrontation. "I didn't sneak around. I told you what was happening." Her ability to rewrite recent history was astounding. Somehow, in her mind, saying it's only a date, after months of deception, constituted honesty and transparency. My laugh was hollow and bitter when it finally came. "You told me after you had already crossed every line that matters in a marriage. You told me when you were ready to hurt me, not when you were ready to be honest with me." Her face twisted with annoyance, frustrated that I wouldn't let her reframe the narrative to make herself the misunderstood heroine of this story. "You just don't want to admit that you're boring," she said, practically spitting the words at me. "I needed more than what you were giving me. You gave me less and less until there was nothing left." The words hung in the air between us like toxic smoke, thick and bitter and poisonous. She walked past me, wine glass in hand, and settled onto our living room couch like nothing earth-shattering had just happened between us. Just like that, in her mind, the conversation was over. Like we were just two incompatible roommates discussing scheduling conflicts rather than spouses whose marriage was disintegrating in real time. I stared at her sitting on our couch, casually sipping wine like she hadn't just tried to make me responsible for her infidelity. Something inside me, something soft and hopeful that had been hanging on despite everything, finally cracked. Not shattered completely because that would come later, but cracked in a way that let me see our situation with brutal clarity for the first time in months. "I want a separation," I said finally, the words leaving my mouth like cold steel. They felt foreign on my tongue, but also strangely liberating. For so long, I had been afraid to say those words out loud, as if speaking them would make our problems real. But our problems had been real for a long time. I had just been the only one pretending otherwise. She didn't even look surprised when I said it. She didn't flinch or gasp, or show any sign that my words had affected her emotionally. She didn't look shocked when I said the word separation, and she didn't even react when I said it again, slower and more deliberately, like maybe she hadn't understood the gravity of what I was telling her the first time. "I want a separation." Victoria took another sip of her wine and let the silence stretch between us. But it wasn't the awkward silence of two people processing difficult emotions. This was weaponized silence, the kind that feels deliberately heavy and manipulative. She was using my words against me, making me sit in the discomfort of what I had just proposed while she maintained complete emotional control. Then, without even bothering to look up from her wine glass, she said simply, "Fine." That was it. No shock, no protest, no attempt to fight for our marriage or suggest counseling or ask if we could work things out. Not even a single fake tear or dramatic gesture. Just fine. delivered with the same casual indifference she might use if I had offered to sleep in the guest room for a single night rather than dissolve our entire life together. I stood there feeling something I couldn't quite name or categorize. It wasn't anger anymore. I had moved past that particular emotion hours ago. This was something deeper and uglier, a kind of mourning that felt like grief. But I wasn't mourning for Victoria or even for our marriage. I was mourning for the man I used to be, the version of myself that had believed she loved me, that had trusted her promises, that had thought our relationship was worth fighting for. "I'll talk to a lawyer this week," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We'll figure out the logistics of the house, the finances, all the practical stuff that comes with ending a marriage. And Rudy," I added, referring to our dog. That finally got her attention. She turned sharply to look at me, her casual indifference replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "You're not taking the dog," she said, her voice rising for the first time since I'd mentioned separation. "Of course I'm taking him," I replied matter-of-factly. "You leave him alone all the time anyway. You're never here to take care of him." It was true. Over the past few months, as Victoria had become more involved with Blake and less invested in our home life, I had become Rudy's primary caretaker by default. She laughed then, but it was a cruel, bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "You think you're the hero in this story? You're not the good guy here, Nathan." "I don't care about being the hero," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "I care about being free. I care about not spending another day married to someone who treats me like an inconvenience in her life." That comment hit something deep inside her. Her face twitched slightly, and she stood up from the couch, walking toward me slowly with her wine glass still in hand. Her voice suddenly became softer, but I could tell it wasn't sincere. It was calculated, manipulative. "So that's it?" she asked, trying to sound hurt and vulnerable. "You're just done? You're giving up on us?" I looked her directly in the eyes for what felt like the first time in months, really seeing her instead of the idealized version I had been clinging to, despite all evidence to the contrary. "No," I said with complete certainty. "You were done with us a long time ago. I'm just finally catching up to where you've been for months." She opened her mouth like she was about to launch into some elaborate guilt trip or emotional manipulation. Maybe a tantrum designed to make me feel like the villain in this situation. But I didn't wait around to hear whatever performance she was preparing to give. I had heard enough lies and justifications for one lifetime. I walked past her toward our bedroom and closed the door behind me, not in anger, but in finality. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay on top of the covers, still fully clothed, staring at the ceiling and listening to Victoria moving around in the next room. At one point, I heard her turn on the television, and the sound of canned laughter from some sitcom drifted through the walls. It was a show she used to beg me to watch with her during the early years of our marriage, back when I would say yes, even when I wasn't particularly interested, just because it made her happy to share those moments together. Now she was watching it alone, and somehow that felt like the perfect metaphor for what our relationship had become. In the darkness of our bedroom, I found myself thinking about all the times I had given Victoria the benefit of the doubt. All those nights when I had convinced myself that she was just tired, just stressed, just figuring some temporary problem out. I thought about how many lies I had swallowed in the name of keeping the peace, how many red flags I had ignored because I wanted to believe in the woman I had married rather than accept the reality of who she had become. I started making a mental list of everything I should have paid attention to, all the warning signs that had been there for months if I had just been willing to see them clearly. The nights she claimed to be working late, but never brought her laptop home with her. The weekend retreat with vague details and no itinerary, where she claimed there would be no cell service but somehow still managed to post photos on social media. The sudden wardrobe changes, the new underwear she didn't want me to see, the cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her clothes and hair. There were the passwords that got changed without explanation, the phone calls she would take in another room, the names that appeared in her text notifications that she never mentioned in conversation, but always made her smile in a way that had nothing to do with me. The late-night dinners at restaurants I had never heard of, charged to our joint credit card but never explained or discussed. By the time the sun started to rise, I had filled 2 mental pages with evidence of Victoria's deception, and I realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. This wasn't really about Blake at all. Blake was just the latest symptom of a much deeper problem. Victoria had been emotionally absent from our marriage long before she physically started stepping outside of it. She had checked out months ago, She had just taken her body along for the ride, while her heart and mind were already somewhere else entirely. The following morning arrived with a strange, loaded quality that reminded me of the stillness that comes right before a thunderstorm hits. There's an electric tension in the air, a sense that everything is about to change whether you're ready for it or not. Victoria was still asleep on the living room couch when I got up, the wine glass from the night before sitting half-finished on our coffee table, the television remote clutched in her hand like a security blanket. A rerun of something cheerful was still playing on the television screen. One of those mindless comedies that make it easier to ignore the chaos of your real life when you can't face dealing with it directly. I didn't wake her up or leave a note explaining where I was going. I simply grabbed Rudy's leash and my car keys and drove away from our house, needing space and distance from everything that reminded me of the life I thought we had been building together. I didn't have any particular destination in mind when I started driving. I just needed to get away from the smell of her perfume that still clung to our curtains, away from the couch where she had curled up like she was single again, away from the kitchen where we had just had the most honest conversation of our entire marriage. And it had been about ending everything we had built together. I drove for nearly 2 hours before finally pulling over at an empty lakeside trail where Rudy and I used to walk regularly when we first got him. Back then, Victoria still came along on these weekend adventures, still held my hand while we watched him chase ducks and bark at squirrels, still laughed at nothing in particular just because we were together, and the world felt full of possibility. Rudy bounded out of my car like nothing catastrophic had happened in his world, his tongue hanging out and his tail wagging with the pure, uncomplicated joy that only dogs seem capable of maintaining. Because dogs don't understand betrayal or broken promises or the slow erosion of love. They just know presence and absence, loyalty and abandonment. And right now I was present, which was all that mattered to him. I sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water and tried to remember how to breathe normally again. The truth had finally settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmovable. Victoria had chosen someone else over time, over honesty, over me. She had made that choice gradually, day by day, lie by lie, until there was nothing left of our marriage except the legal paperwork and shared mailing address. But the most sickening part of this entire nightmare wasn't that she had done it. The most devastating realization was how easily she had managed it, how she didn't look back or hesitate, or show even a moment of genuine remorse. She had already rewritten our entire history in her head, transforming herself into the misunderstood heroine of a story where I was the boring, emotionally unavailable villain, and she was just a woman trying to feel alive again. At noon, my phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria that made me laugh out loud with its sheer audacity. "So you're just going to disappear now?" Real mature. There was no apology in that message, no regret, no acknowledgement that she had spent months systematically destroying our marriage. Just blame and criticism, as if I was the one behaving badly by refusing to stick around and watch her continue her affair. 10 minutes later, another message arrived that somehow managed to be even more infuriating than the first. "If you don't want to work on this, just say it. Don't play the martyr." The nerve of that statement. The absolute audacity of suggesting that I was the one who didn't want to work on our relationship made me realize just how completely she had rewritten reality in her own mind. Work on what? I wanted to ask her. She hadn't wanted to work on anything when she was slipping into someone else's car for romantic dinners. She hadn't been interested in putting effort into our marriage when she was planning secret weekend getaways with Blake. She only wanted to work on things now that she realized I wasn't going to play the role she had assigned me. The forgiving, quiet husband who would take her back with a sigh and a glass of wine, grateful for whatever scraps of attention she was willing to throw my way. But that version of me was gone, permanently erased by months of lies and casual cruelty. I turned off my phone and refused to engage with her attempts to make me the villain in her story. That afternoon, sitting by the water with Rudy sprawled contentedly at my feet, I made a plan for my life that didn't include Victoria's drama or manipulation. It wasn't a dramatic or vengeful plan. I was beyond the need for grand gestures or ultimatums. This was simply a practical, methodical list of actions that would allow me to reclaim my dignity and move forward with purpose. First, I would talk to a divorce attorney as soon as possible to understand my options and rights. Second, I needed to secure my finances and get my name off any joint accounts that Victoria could use to complicate things. Third, I would arrange a temporary place to stay while we sorted out the legal aspects of separating our lives. Fourth, I would take Rudy with me. That wasn't negotiable, especially considering how much she had been neglecting him in favor of her new relationship. But there was one last item on my mental list that I circled 3 times in my mind. I would not let Victoria rewrite the narrative of what had happened between us, because I knew that's exactly what she would try to do. Women like Victoria, people like Victoria, always found a way to transform their betrayals into poetry, to turn blame into self-care, to make themselves the victim of circumstances beyond their control. She would tell people that I was bitter, distant, emotionally unavailable. She would claim that she had tried to communicate with me, but I wouldn't listen. She would paint herself as a woman who was simply trying to find happiness after years of being trapped in a loveless marriage. But none of those revised stories would change the fundamental truth of what had actually happened. She chose someone else, she lied repeatedly, and I was done giving her more chances than she had ever given me. I drove back to our house just after sunset, feeling calmer and more resolved than I had in months. The house was dim when I arrived, with only the kitchen light providing any illumination. Victoria was sitting on one of our counter stools with her legs crossed, looking like she had been waiting for me to return so she could deliver whatever speech she had been preparing during my absence. She had a glass of wine in her hand again. She always had a glass of wine these days. Like alcohol had become her armor, her excuse, her ceremonial preparation for difficult conversations. "You finally decided to come home," she said, without bothering to look at me directly. Her tone was accusatory, as if I had been the one behaving unreasonably by needing space to process the fact that my wife was having an affair. I dropped Rudy's leash and let him run to his bed in the corner, choosing not to respond to her provocation. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms folded, clearly expecting some kind of dramatic confrontation or emotional breakdown that would allow her to maintain control of the situation. "So what now, Nathan?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm and false concern. "You storm off, ignore me all day, and then what? We pretend we're still a team? We go back to acting like nothing has changed between us?" I stepped closer to her, but not too close. Close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when she realized I wasn't going to play the part she expected, but far enough away to maintain my emotional distance. For months, she had held all the power in our relationship through her smirks, her taunts, her casual cruelty, her ability to make me feel like I was asking for too much when I wanted basic honesty and respect. But now I could see that power starting to slip away from her. "There is no we anymore," I said calmly but firmly. "I just came back to tell you exactly what happens next." She blinked in surprise, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw genuine hesitation in her expression. A moment of real uncertainty flickered across her face as she realized that the power dynamics between us had fundamentally shifted. The smirks, the taunts, the casual cruelty that she had been wielding like weapons, all of it suddenly felt less effective when confronted with someone who was no longer afraid of losing her. "I'm filing for separation and divorce," I said flatly, my voice carrying none of the emotion or desperation she was probably expecting. "Whatever legal process gets this marriage dissolved as quickly and cleanly as possible, that's what I'm going to pursue." "You're serious?" Her voice rose with what might have been surprise or panic. I couldn't tell which, and frankly, I didn't care anymore. "Dead serious," I replied without hesitation. She set her wine glass down on the granite countertop harder than necessary, the sound echoing through our kitchen like a small explosion. "Wow, you really are a coward," she said, reaching for the one word she knew had always been able to wound me in the past. But that word, coward, became the final trigger that released whatever remaining restraint I had been maintaining. I stepped forward, close enough to see the shock in her eyes when she realized her usual manipulation tactics weren't going to work this time. "No," I said, my voice rising for the first time in this entire conversation. "A coward is someone who lies to their husband for months while planning romantic getaways with another man. A coward is someone who sneaks around at night, deceiving the person who loves them most. A coward is someone who has the audacity to act offended and victimized when they finally get caught in their web of lies." She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. Months of swallowed anger and suppressed hurt were finally finding their voice. "A coward is someone who calls infidelity just a date and expects their spouse to smile and accept it. You think I checked out of this marriage? You pushed me out, Victoria. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an audience for your life, someone to sit quietly in the background while you pursued whatever excitement caught your fancy." Her face hardened as she realized I wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. "You don't know what it's like to feel invisible in your own home," she said, grasping for some justification that would make her behavior seem reasonable. I nearly laughed at the irony of that statement. Victoria, you weren't invisible in our home. You were just bored. And instead of talking to me about it, instead of trying to work on our relationship together, you decided to unilaterally rewrite the rules of our marriage and then blame me when I didn't applaud your choices. She grabbed her wine glass again, and I noticed her hands were shaking now, the first real crack I had seen in her carefully constructed facade of indifference. You're twisting everything that happened between us, she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. No, I said, feeling calmer now that I had finally spoken my truth. I'm just seeing our situation clearly for the first time in a very long time. I'm seeing you clearly, and I'm seeing myself clearly, and I don't like what either of those pictures shows me. She went quiet then, looking away from me like she couldn't maintain eye contact anymore. That's when I realized something that was both brutal and liberating. She genuinely hadn't expected me to leave. She had thought I would rage and threaten and maybe cry, but she never believed I would actually walk away from our marriage. Deep down, Victoria had convinced herself that I needed her more than she had ever needed me. And now, faced with concrete evidence that this wasn't true, she had nothing left to say. I turned and walked toward the hallway, feeling lighter than I had in months. As I reached our bedroom door, she called after me one final time, her voice carrying that familiar tone of superiority she used whenever she wanted to have the last word in an argument. "You'll regret this," she said, like she was delivering some kind of prophetic warning about my future. I paused in the doorway but didn't turn around to face her. "No," I said with absolute certainty. "But you might." The next morning brought an eerie quiet to our house that felt different from the tense silences we had been living with for months. There were no accusations flying across the breakfast table, no passive-aggressive remarks disguised as casual conversation, no slamming of doors or dramatic exits. Victoria was actively avoiding me, which was actually a relief after months of her confrontational energy dominating every interaction we had. I could hear her movements from across the house, the clink of coffee cups in the kitchen, the shuffle of bags being packed, the quick pacing of someone who didn't want to be seen but still needed to be noticed. She left for work without saying goodbye, which gave me the time and space I needed to start making the phone calls that would change both our lives permanently. By 10 o'clock in the morning, I had spoken to a divorce attorney named Carla Jensen. She was professional, direct, and refreshingly honest about what the process would involve. She listened without judgment as I laid out everything: the emotional abandonment, the lies, the evidence of infidelity I had discovered on Victoria's laptop. When I finished explaining our situation, she asked me the one question I had been avoiding since this whole nightmare started. "Do you want to fight for this marriage?" she asked simply. The answer came out of my mouth before I even had time to think about it consciously. No. That single word carried the weight of months of realization. The accumulated understanding that some things are too broken to repair. That some people change in ways that make them incompatible with the life you thought you were building together. That afternoon, I started the practical work of separating my life from Victoria's. I began pulling things from drawers and closets, not her belongings, just mine. Old receipts, financial statements, important documents that had gotten mixed together over 9 years of shared living space. I found my grandmother's watch that Victoria had stuffed in a shoebox under our bed years ago, claiming she was organizing, but really just shoving my sentimental items out of sight. As I sorted through these fragments of my identity, I realized how much of myself I had lost in the process of trying to keep our marriage alive. Little pieces of who I was before Victoria had convinced me to lose myself for the sake of keeping the peace, for the sake of being the good husband who never rocked the boat or demanded too much attention or asked inconvenient questions about late nights and changed passwords. I sat down at our kitchen table and created a file on my laptop labeled Victoria Exit. It wasn't revenge or spite that motivated me. It was pure self-protection. I methodically added every piece of evidence I had accumulated. Photos I had taken of the messages I'd seen on her laptop, screen captures of the cabin booking with Blake's name on it, bank statements showing her late-night charges at restaurants I'd never been to, receipts from stores where she'd bought clothes I'd never seen her wear. Victoria had always had an exceptional ability to spin situations in her favor, to turn arguments into accusations, to transform facts into feelings that could be dismissed or reinterpreted. I had watched her do it countless times over the years, usually in minor disagreements that she would somehow twist until I was apologizing for things I hadn't done, I knew exactly how this divorce would go once the legal papers hit her mailbox. She would cry to her friends and family, painting herself as the victim of a cold, unfeeling husband who had given up on their marriage without trying to work things out. She would claim that I was emotionally distant, that I never listened to her needs, that I had forced her to seek connection elsewhere because I couldn't provide what she needed. This time, however, I wouldn't be left without receipts to counter her revised version of our story. Victoria came home later than usual that evening, around 8:30, and I was sitting on our back porch with Rudy lying contentedly at my feet. The sky had turned that burnt orange color that only happens during Florida summers, and for a brief moment, I felt something approaching peace. She stepped outside without asking permission, like she was testing whether I would object to her presence in my space. "You're really doing this?" she asked quietly, her voice lacking the confrontational edge it had carried during our kitchen argument the night before. I didn't look at her when I answered. "Yeah, I am." She stayed silent for a long time, and I could feel her studying my profile, maybe searching for some sign that I was bluffing or hoping she would beg me to reconsider. Finally, she spoke again, and her words revealed more about her mindset than anything she had said previously. "You know, for a while," she said, her voice taking on an almost wistful quality, "I thought you'd just accept it, that we'd settle into something new where you do your thing, I'd do mine, and we'd keep the house, keep the life we built, keep up appearances for everyone else." I turned to look at her then, genuinely stunned by what she had just admitted. "That's not marriage, Victoria. That's survival. And I stopped being willing to just survive the minute you started living like I didn't exist." Her eyes welled up with tears, but I found myself completely unmoved by the display of emotion. Those tears felt calculated, performed, like everything else about her recent behavior. "I don't hate you," I added, because it was important to me that she understood this wasn't about revenge or bitterness. "But I can't stay married to someone who lies this easily, who cheats and calls it personal growth, who disrespects me and calls it finding herself." She looked like she wanted to argue, to fight back with the same defensive energy she had shown the night before. I could see her searching for some sharp comment that would crack my resolve and make me doubt my decision. But nothing came out of her mouth, because deep down in a place she couldn't deny or rationalize, she knew I was absolutely right. That night, I moved my belongings into the guest room, not for her comfort or convenience, but for my own peace of mind. The master bedroom didn't feel like mine anymore. It was saturated with the smell of her perfume, haunted by the sight of her robe draped over the door, poisoned by the memory of being lied to within those walls. Everything about that space needed to stay there, trapped in the past where it belonged. The guest bed was harder than our king-size mattress, and the room was noticeably colder without the shared body heat I'd gotten used to over 9 years of marriage. But despite the physical discomfort, I slept better that night than I had in weeks. For the first time in months, I wasn't lying awake waiting for her to come home, wasn't wondering who she was with or what lies she would tell me in the morning. I wasn't carrying the exhausting burden of trying to save a marriage that only one person was fighting for. The next few days felt like walking through the ruins of a city I used to love. Familiar landmarks were still there, but everything had been fundamentally altered by some catastrophic event. Victoria didn't speak much during this period, but she hovered around our shared spaces in a way that felt deliberately noticeable. She made coffee without asking if I wanted any, cleaned the living room more thoroughly than usual, left music playing in the background like we were still trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But these performances didn't move me anymore. I could see them for what they really were: desperate attempts to maintain some illusion of domestic harmony, last-ditch efforts to make our situation feel manageable and fixable. She hadn't expected this version of me, the one who remained quiet and calm and absolutely certain about what needed to happen next. She had been prepared for tears, screaming, emotional breakdowns that she could use to her advantage. Instead, she got a man who had finally stopped bleeding for a woman who never brought bandages to the wounds she inflicted. On Thursday morning, I served Victoria the initial separation paperwork. She came home from work that evening to find a manila envelope sitting on our kitchen counter with her name typed clearly across the front. There was no accompanying note, no explanation beyond what the legal documents inside would provide. I wanted the papers to speak for themselves, to communicate the seriousness of my intentions without any dramatic flourishes or emotional manipulation. She found me in the guest room about 20 minutes after discovering the envelope, storming through the door with the papers clutched in her hand and her cheeks flushed red with indignation. "Are you serious?" she hissed. waving the documents like they were evidence of some terrible injustice I had committed against her. I looked up from my laptop with the same calm demeanor I had been maintaining for days. "Completely serious," I replied. "You could have talked to me about this first," she said, her voice rising with each word. The irony of that statement, coming from someone who had made unilateral decisions about our marriage for months without any consultation, was so thick I could practically taste it. "I did talk to you," I said, my voice remaining level and controlled. "For months, actually. You just weren't listening because you were too busy planning your new life with Blake." She dropped the envelope on the floor like it had burned her fingers, papers scattering across the hardwood. "You're really going to make me the villain in this story?" she demanded, her eyes flashing with that familiar rage she displayed whenever the world didn't applaud her choices or validate her version of reality. "You made yourself the villain," I said simply. "I'm just refusing to pretend otherwise anymore." Her eyes narrowed dangerously, and there it was again. That Victoria fury that emerged whenever she couldn't control the narrative or manipulate someone into seeing things her way. "You think this is all my fault?" she asked, her voice dripping with accusation and self-righteousness. "No," I said, closing my laptop slowly and standing up to face her. "But the part where you decided to have an affair while married to me, that's entirely your responsibility. The lying, the sneaking around, the romantic cabin bookings with another man, those were your choices, not mine." She stared at me like she wanted to either slap me or break down crying, but she did neither. Instead, she just stood there breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling like she was working up the courage to launch into another round of blame and deflection. "You know what?" she said finally, her voice taking on that tone of righteous indignation she used when she felt cornered. "You were always so obsessed with being the good guy, with being calm and logical and morally superior. It's exhausting to live with someone who thinks they're perfect all the time." I closed the distance between us slowly, not in a threatening way, but with the confidence of someone who finally understood exactly who they were dealing with. "Maybe I did try too hard to be the good guy," I said, "but at least I didn't destroy the person who loved me just to chase a thrill that I'll probably forget about in a year." Her face crumbled when I said those words, but not because I had hurt her feelings or wounded her emotionally. No, her expression collapsed because she realized that the one power she had always been able to wield over me, her ability to make me doubt myself, to wound me with carefully chosen words, to make me feel like I was somehow failing her, that power was completely gone now. She could see it in my eyes, hear it in my voice. I wasn't hers to manipulate anymore. I walked past her toward the door, moving with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found solid ground after months of trying to navigate quicksand. There was no anger in my movements, no dramatic gestures or raised voices. Just a man who was done with the games, done with the lies, done with accepting crumbs of affection from someone who should have been offering me a full meal. She didn't follow me as I left the room. She didn't call my name or make one final attempt to salvage the situation. She just stood there in the guest room doorway, holding those legal papers like they were a verdict she hadn't expected, watching me walk away from a version of myself that had tolerated far more disrespect than anyone should ever accept. That night, I made one final addition to the notebook I had been keeping since this nightmare began. On a fresh page, I wrote, August 8th. She finally saw what I've been seeing for months. I'm not hers anymore. Those words felt like a declaration of independence, a formal acknowledgement that I had reclaimed ownership of my own life and dignity. 2 days later, Victoria packed a bag without any warning or ceremony. I came back from walking Rudy to find her in our master bedroom, tossing clothes into a black duffel bag like she was running late for some important appointment. Her movements were sharp, quick, and aggressive. Every shirt folded seemed like an argument she was trying not to have. Every item packed felt like an accusation she was holding back. I leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. Just watched her prepare to leave the life we had built together. She didn't look at me initially, too focused on her packing, or perhaps too proud to acknowledge that I was witnessing this moment of defeat. I'm going to my sister's, she announced finally, her voice carrying a tone that suggested I should somehow care about her living arrangements or feel guilty about her temporary displacement. Okay, I replied simply, offering no objection or false concern. She paused in her packing, clearly waiting for something more dramatic from me. When my calm acceptance didn't change, she turned toward me with her arms crossed defensively. You're not even going to ask me to stay? She said, her voice rising with what might have been genuine surprise. I met her eyes with steady composure. No, because I'm not going to spend another day trying to convince someone to love me. I'm not going to beg someone to choose me when they've already made it clear that I'm not what they want. Her jaw clenched at my words. That's not fair, she said. But her protest sounded weak even to her own ears. You're absolutely right, I said, nodding in agreement. Fair would have been honesty from the beginning. Fair would have been loyalty, respect, and basic human decency. You gave me none of those things, Victoria. So no, this situation isn't fair, but not in the way you think. She looked away from me, unable to maintain eye contact, and for just a second, I saw something flicker behind her carefully constructed mask. Maybe it was guilt, maybe panic, or maybe just the dawning realization that her actions had consequences she hadn't fully considered. This wasn't a temporary fight that would blow over after a few days of silent treatment. I wasn't playing hard to get or trying to teach her a lesson. I was genuinely, permanently done with her. She zipped up her duffel bag with more force than necessary, the sound sharp and final in the quiet of our bedroom. You act like you've been perfect this whole time, she snapped, making one last attempt to shift the blame back onto me, to make me responsible for the choices she had made. I haven't been perfect, I said calmly, not taking the bait she was offering. But I've been present. I showed up every day for this marriage, even when it became clear that you had already left months ago. You didn't just leave emotionally, you took your body along for the ride, while your heart and mind were somewhere else entirely. Her lip trembled slightly, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw Victoria genuinely shaken. Not because she missed me or regretted her actions, but because she had finally lost her grip on the story she had been telling herself. For months, she had maintained this narrative where I was passive and forgettable, too forgiving to ever actually leave, too dependent on her to risk being alone. Now, faced with the reality that I was walking away, she had no script to follow. She hoisted the bag over her shoulder and pushed past me without another word. No goodbye, no final attempt at reconciliation, no last-minute dramatics. Just her keys in her hand, and the front door slamming shut behind her with enough force to rattle the picture frames hanging in our hallway. The silence that followed her departure wasn't painful or oppressive like the tense quiet we had been living with for months. Instead, it felt like a relief, like something toxic had finally been aired out of our home. I fed Rudy, made myself a simple dinner, and sat on our couch to watch television without having to negotiate volume levels or channel preferences with someone who resented my presence. I didn't wonder where Victoria was staying or who she was with. For the first time in forever, the house felt genuinely still, not in that suffocating way that makes you feel trapped, but in a clean, honest way that allowed me to breathe normally again. It was like the air itself had been purified now that it was no longer thick with lies and unspoken accusations. At 9:47 that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but devastating. She's not who you think she is. You deserve better. Sorry it took me this long. B. I stared at that message for a long time, stunned by the implications of what I was reading. Blake, the man Victoria had been planning romantic getaways with, the person she claimed made her feel alive again, was apparently having second thoughts about the woman who had destroyed her marriage to be with him. Even he had figured out what kind of person she really was, and it had taken him much less time than it had taken me. I didn't respond to Blake's message because there was no point. His text wasn't really for me anyway. It was a confession to himself, a way of acknowledging that he had gotten involved with someone who was reckless enough to ruin whatever she touched without looking back or taking responsibility for the damage she caused. Whatever fantasy Victoria had constructed with Blake had clearly crumbled under the weight of reality much faster than our 9-year marriage had. I could imagine how it had fallen apart, probably in the same way our relationship had deteriorated, but compressed into weeks rather than months. She had likely revealed the same casual cruelty, the same inability to take accountability, the same talent for making everyone around her responsible for her happiness except herself. Blake had seen her clearly now, maybe not as a monster, but certainly as someone dangerous to be around. Someone who would light your life on fire and then blame you for the smoke. Someone who would rewrite history to make herself the victim of circumstances beyond her control, even when she was the one holding the matches. I never replied to Blake's message because I didn't need to validate or respond to his revelation. His text wasn't seeking my forgiveness or trying to make amends. It was simply a man admitting to himself that he had gotten tangled up with someone whose destructive patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. He had discovered what I had learned over 9 long years. Victoria was capable of spectacular cruelty when things didn't go exactly according to her plans. She didn't come home that night, or the next night either. I didn't ask where she was staying or call her sister to check on her welfare. The silence in our house became familiar rather than unsettling. Not warm exactly, but honest in a way that our forced conversations had never been. This was the kind of quiet that doesn't lie to you or demand that you pretend everything is fine when it clearly isn't. I began the process of packing what truly belonged to me, preparing for a permanent separation rather than some temporary cooling-off period. Every photograph where we smiled at the camera but didn't mean it went into storage boxes. Every gift she had given me after a fight, the kind of presents that were meant to substitute for real apologies or genuine change, found its way into donation bags. The couch we had picked out together during our second year of marriage stayed exactly where it was. I didn't care about claiming furniture anymore. I just wanted distance from the memories that had been poisoned by months of lies. The divorce attorney called to inform me that the legal documents were in motion and that Victoria would be served officially within the next week. I felt absolutely nothing when I heard that news. Not sadness, not satisfaction, not relief. Just the calm certainty that comes with forward motion after being stuck in place for far too long. On Saturday afternoon, while cleaning out our garage, I found an old shoebox tucked behind some paint cans that I hadn't seen in years. Inside were dozens of cards Victoria had written me over the course of our relationship. Birthday messages, anniversary notes, little love letters from before everything between us had soured into resentment and indifference. I sat on the concrete floor and read through one card from our second year of marriage that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. In her familiar handwriting, she had written, "You're the safest place I've ever known." I stared at that line for a long time, remembering how much I had believed her when she wrote those words, how proud I had been to be someone's safe harbor in an unpredictable world. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. I had been exactly that for her, a safe place, a reliable constant, someone she could count on to be there no matter how badly she treated me. Until she had decided to burn that safe place to the ground and then blamed me for the smoke and ashes that remained. I carried the shoebox outside and set it on fire in our metal trash can, not out of anger or revenge, but because I didn't want to carry those lies into whatever came next in my life. I didn't want to keep evidence of promises that had meant everything to me, but apparently nothing to the person who wrote them. Watching those cards turn to ash felt like a necessary cleansing, a way of officially closing the door on a chapter of my life that had taught me everything I needed to know about my own worth. That evening, Victoria sent me a text message that felt like one final attempt to regain some control over our narrative. "Can we talk?" The message contained no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had done, no explanation for her behavior. Just a vague request that probably meant she wanted to negotiate the terms of our separation in a way that would benefit her. An hour later, when I didn't respond, she sent another message that revealed more about her mindset than anything she had said in weeks. "You're being cold. We shared a life together." The audacity of that statement. The suggestion that I was somehow being unreasonable by refusing to engage with someone who had systematically destroyed our marriage was almost breathtaking in its selfishness. That message made me pause and really think about what she meant when she said, "We shared a life." Yes, we had shared a life together for 9 years. But I had been the one building it, maintaining it, protecting it, and carrying it forward, even when she had emotionally checked out and started investing her energy elsewhere. She had shared the benefits of our life together, the financial security, the social status, the comfort of having someone who would always be there. But she hadn't shared the burden of actually sustaining what we had created. I didn't respond to either of her messages. Instead, I made a decision that felt both symbolic and practical. I blocked her phone number. That simple action represented the moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was free. Not because she was physically gone from my life, but because I no longer wanted her back. I no longer felt that desperate, hollow ache of missing someone who had never really been present in the first place. The next morning, I woke up in my small apartment for the first time. It wasn't much to look at. A modest kitchen with cheap appliances, basic blinds instead of the custom window treatments Victoria had insisted on, a view of the back of another apartment building rather than our landscaped backyard. But this space was entirely mine. It was clean, untouched by lies, free from the emotional ghosts that had haunted every room of our former home. I had a battered coffee table I'd picked up from a thrift store, a mattress on the floor that would have horrified Victoria's sense of style, and Rudy snoring like a chainsaw in the corner, completely content as long as I was nearby. The apartment was quiet in that honest way I had grown to appreciate, not the tense silence of a relationship dying, not the forced quiet of two people avoiding difficult conversations, but the genuine peace that comes when you're finally living authentically. I thought I would feel empty in this new space, maybe even lonely or regretful about the dramatic changes I had made to my life. Instead, all I felt was steady, grounded. Like I had finally found solid footing after months of trying to build something meaningful on shifting sand. I had done what needed to be done when it would have been easier to stay bitter and resentful. I had chosen clarity over chaos, self-respect over false hope. While Victoria would probably spend months, maybe years, telling her version of our story to anyone willing to listen, a version where I was cold and distant and emotionally unavailable, where she was just a misunderstood woman trying to feel alive again. I didn't care anymore about controlling that narrative. I knew the truth about what had happened between us, and that was enough. I had given her years of chances to be honest with me. I had offered her time, grace, love, and forgiveness, even when she didn't deserve any of those things. I had given her myself completely and authentically, holding nothing back. And she had gambled that generosity against the excitement of someone new, betting that I would never have the courage to actually walk away from her. But I did walk away. I left when staying would have been easier and more comfortable. I chose the uncertainty of starting over rather than the familiar misery of accepting disrespect as the price of companionship. She had looked me in the eye that first night and said, "Relax, it's only a date." She had wanted those words to hurt me, to establish her power over our relationship, to show me that she could do whatever she pleased, and I would have no choice but to accept it. What she actually did was give me permission to stop fighting for someone who had already given up on us months earlier. Now I lived alone in a small apartment, wearing no wedding ring, carrying no guilt about the choices I had made. Not because I had lost something valuable, but because I had finally learned something crucial about my own worth. I had discovered that loyalty isn't something you owe to people who consistently disrespect you, that love doesn't require you to excuse betrayal, and that no matter how much time you invest in someone, the moment they stop valuing your presence is the moment you have complete permission to walk away without apology. So here's my advice to anyone reading this who might be wondering if they're going crazy, wondering if maybe they're asking for too much when they expect basic honesty, effort, and respect from their partner. You're not asking for too much. You're not being unreasonable. You're not imagining the problems in your relationship or being overly sensitive about behaviors that would concern any rational person. If your gut is screaming that something is wrong, listen to that instinct. If the story your partner is telling doesn't make sense, dig deeper and ask the hard questions. If someone looks you in the eye and lies to you repeatedly, don't wait around hoping that the truth will eventually come dressed in flowers and apologies. It never will. Dishonest people don't suddenly develop integrity just because you love them enough or wait patiently enough. Some people simply don't deserve your patience. Some people will take your kindness, your forgiveness, your willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt, and they will use all of those beautiful qualities against you. They will exploit your capacity for love as a weakness rather than recognizing it as the gift it actually is. These people don't deserve you, not your time, not your energy, not your emotional investment, and certainly not your loyalty. I don't hate Victoria, and I probably never will. Hatred requires a level of emotional investment that I'm no longer willing to give her. But I will also never love her again. And that realization, more than anything else that happened between us, represents the real ending of our story. The divorce papers were just paperwork. The actual end came the night she walked out our front door, and I realized I didn't want her to come back. The most important thing I learned from this entire experience is that you can't love someone into being a better person. You can't forgive someone into developing a conscience. You can't be patient enough, or understanding enough, or supportive enough to make someone choose you when they've already decided they want to choose someone else. All you can do is recognize when someone is showing you who they really are, believe them the first time, and act accordingly. Victoria showed me exactly who she was over the course of many months. She was someone who could lie without flinching, who could plan romantic getaways with other men while sharing a bed with her husband, who could justify betrayal as personal growth and blame her spouse for not being excited about her infidelity. She was someone who valued her own temporary happiness more than 9 years of marriage. Someone who would rather destroy something beautiful than do the hard work of maintaining it. I wasted far too much time trying to decode her behavior, trying to find reasonable explanations for unreasonable actions, trying to be the perfect husband for someone who had stopped trying to be any kind of wife at all. But the truth was always simple, even when I was too scared or too hopeful to accept it. She didn't want to be married to me anymore, and instead of having an honest conversation about that reality, she chose to pursue someone else while keeping me around as a safety net. The night she said, "Relax, it's only a date," she thought she was establishing her dominance in our relationship. She thought she was showing me that I had no power to stop her from doing whatever she wanted. What she actually did was give me the clarity I needed to stop participating in her version of marriage. She set me free from the obligation to keep fighting for someone who had already surrendered without telling me the war was over. So if you're reading this and you recognize your own situation in my story, please understand. You deserve better than someone who treats your love like an inconvenience. You deserve better than someone who makes you feel crazy for expecting basic honesty and respect. You deserve someone who chooses you every day, not someone who keeps you around while they audition replacements. Don't wait for them to change. Don't wait for them to realize what they're losing. Don't wait for them to suddenly develop the capacity for remorse or accountability that they've never shown before. Just walk away with your dignity intact, knowing that some people are simply not capable of loving you the way you deserve to be loved. And remember, walking away from someone who doesn't value you isn't giving up on love. It's making space for the right kind of love to find you when you're ready for it.